And meanwhile, the ship is a combination of both practical effects and computer graphics, which is something that today we're still there was that shift to full CGI, and now we're applauding people for going back to a combination of those two things.
Welcome to Into the Wardrobe, our show exploring classic children's films. I'm Sean.
I'm Jen.
And on today's show, we'll be discussing Flight of the Navigator, a 1986 film directed by Randall Kleiser, written by Michael Burton and Phil Jono, based on, apparently, a story by Mark H. Baker. The film stars Joey Kramer, Cliff DeYoung, Veronica Cartwright, and a very young Sarah Jessica Parker, the amazing Howard Hessman, and... apparently, Jen wants me to do a drum roll, please. Not what you think the person is, because the actual actor didn't want his voice to be recognized in this film.
What?
That is correct. I believe he went by the name Paul Mall.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure it's Paul Mall,
yeah.
But he went by a different name. That is Paul Rubens, a.k.a. Pee Wee Herman.
No, it's Pee Wee Herman, a.k.a. Paul Rubens.
Well, not anymore, not in the present, now that Paul Rubens has been arrested for touching himself in a theater.
Yeah, fair enough.
But before we get to talking about this movie, which is a film Jen and I both watched as children, we'd love to hear from you. So just go to skiffingfanny.com/listener suggestions. Send us a note about what you thought of what we talked about. So that's how you do it. Go do it.
Or what we're going to talk about, rather.
Well, how do you know that we haven't already done it yet?
I don't know.
Because we could, in fact, be time traveling today, Jen.
We could. This could all be 8 years ago or 8 years from now. I don't know.
Honestly, just don't try to make sense of the timeline.
Timey-wimey. So, Flight of the Navigator is, as we just discussed, a little bit of a time travel movie. So it's about a 12-year-old boy named David who in the year 1978 falls into a ditch chasing his little brother and is knocked unconscious, only to find himself awakening 8 years later to find that everything has changed, as things do when 8 years pass. Plus, there's an AI spaceship voiced by Pee Wee Herman, because even though he may have tried to quote-unquote disguise his voice and go in under a different name, it is so clearly Pee Wee Herman that there's like no mistaking him for someone else. I will give you a content warning for very brief moments of fat phobia and ableism, and then also for those of you who might have a trigger about this, there is what seems to be abduction, at least from the parent's standpoint. So that could be a triggering element of this film. And that's about it. It's a pretty simple plot. So, Sean, what are your impressions of this delightful blast from the past?
Well, one, I want to say that you're incorrect, that it is very obvious that it's Pee Wee Herman. It's only very obvious that it's Pee Wee Herman after he downloads his brainwaves and becomes all personable and, like, weird and strange. Because at first, I thought, like, oh, well, maybe maybe I just didn't remember this movie. Maybe Paul Rubens plays, like, an actual alien.
Right.
You know, because the voice doesn't come across as the Pee Wee Herman. And then he downloads those memories and becomes, yeah.
And then it becomes full Pee Wee Herman.
Yeah.
And that's true. I will totally admit to that. In the first, half of this movie? Well, for the first half of this movie, you don't actually have any speaking from what eventually becomes the Max character, which is the AI of this ship.
Right.
Alien spaceship that has appeared on Earth in the year 1986. It isn't until David, the boy, is actually directly introduced to that ship and then eventually has his mind uploaded into the ship that the ship becomes more quote-unquote human and therefore sounds like Pee Wee Herman. And he is hilarious. I love that aspect of the ship, personally, so...
They had fun with it.
That was fun, yes.
Yeah, so in terms of general impressions, Jen, so I will say that as an adult, this film did not scare me as it did as a kid.
I'm very glad to hear that
Yeah.
because I would be kind of concerned if this did scare you.
I mean, the little alien creatures are pretty creepy.
The eye.
I mean, the eyeball and some of the other things. And, like, if you're a 12-year-old kid,
Yeah.
you're interacting with this AI in this ship that is not quite behaving in ways that make sense to you. You know, and also, you know, it's kind of scary to get voices in your mind from an alien spacecraft. Just saying. I don't know how often that's happened to you, Jen, but...
Oh, all the time.
Yeah, all the time.
You know.
Yeah. So unlike other films that we've watched...
Aren't you a voice in my head, Sean? Isn't that all this is?
God, I wish, because I would torture you endlessly.
That's really mean.
I know.
But go ahead. Please continue.
Yeah, so like unlike other films that we have watched for this, which have been pretty terrifying, you know, Goonies scared me a bit. You know, Neverending Story I consider to be a horror film, period. It still scares me to this day. This film, not really. It's actually a lot of fun. And I think that's really what it comes down to, that Flight of the Navigator is a very simple plot, but it is also just a lot of fun. And as an 80s nostalgic dork that I am, I danced through half of this damn movie. I can't. Alan Silvestri is the composer for this, and almost everything done for this was either composed by him using synthesizers and electronic music equipment, or was written in, you know, with 80s stylings in mind. There's a Cure reference that's in here. They don't actually have The Cure. They have a different band that wrote. A different group of people that wrote one of the Cure's songs do a different song that's clearly a parody of the Cure song, which is really cute and also probably saved them a bit of money. You know, like there's a lot of fun bits here. And Max is a lot of fun. The spacecraft's a lot of fun. This is like a fun, different take on the E.T. sort of storyline, because it's a lot like E.T. in that respect. It's just, it's the spacecraft that's the alien rather than, you know, like a Reese's Pieces eating demon creature from hell. Yeah.
What?
No, E.T.'s scary. E.T. is scary.
Yes. And I think that's... Stop doing that.
Ouch, Elliot. Ouch.
You're the worst. So I think that is one of the big differences here between E.T. and Flight of the Navigator, because you're right, they are kind of exploring some of the similar things, but we're going to get to that in a minute when we talk about the film more specifically. My overall impression was actually that this film, as an adult, was actually more stressful for me than it was when I was a kid. Also, I apparently did not remember anything about this movie. All I remembered was the ship and flying around in the ship. I did not remember that Pee Wee Herman was the voice. I did not remember about the time travel portion of that. And that's kind of a big part of this movie. All of that was just kind of gone. Interestingly, now that I'm an adult, I found it much more stressful because of the fact that I'm a parent. So I had kind of put myself more in the parents' shoes versus David's shoes. And as a kid, I was 8 when this movie came out. So I was actually the kid's brother's, Jeff. I was his age when the movie first came out. And like seeing him like suddenly be 16, that was like, whoa. But also seeing Elliot flying around in the spaceship is super cool. And I love it. But seeing the stress that the parents go through was a lot for me this time. And which I was not expecting at all because I didn't remember the movie at all. So that was kind of a new thing for me in watching these nostalgic films. We had it a little bit, if I recall, when we talked about E.T.
Yeah.
Because the E.T. is very much more about the normalization of the nuclear family, right? That's basically the conclusion we came to. And repairing the nuclear family. This didn't have that, like, sort of heavy-handed approach to the nuclear family, I don't think.
No, it's kind of different because he just
yeah.
wants to go home. Like,
he just wants to go home.
He is 12.
Right. And I will say that the actor Joey Kramer is very, very good at being a vulnerable 12-year-old boy.
Yeah. He gets praise for this performance in particular.
Yeah. He did an incredible job portraying just that the fear of what has happened to him and the fear of what could happen to him, of being separated from his parents who suddenly have aged 8 years, of all the strangeness. He did an incredible job and was incredibly emotive for a very young actor who unfortunately kind of had the same issues as a lot of other young actors.
True.
Later in life, but he was incredible. And that, I think, alone was part of sort of the effect that it had on me as an adult. Like, seeing a child that afraid and feeling alone and all of those things was very effective. So that's kind of my general impression, I guess, with some more specifics, because I'm terrible at giving general impressions.
I mean, you're terrible at many things, Jen, but,
It is true.
it's fine. You can't even keep a straight face during a call. It's ridiculous.
I can't.
You just can't.
It's impossible.
No, that's true. I do have a very expressive face. I'm like the Joker, but not evil.
I'm gonna go with you're like the Joker and also evil.
Yeah, but I've never exposed you to toxic waste just to see what it did to your body.
That's true. And you don't, put a bunch of people on boats and...
Yeah, and I've never put, those little clappy teeth, but like that are electrified and they give you a shock capable of killing you. Yeah,
are slightly terrifying. I'll be honest.
Yeah, I've never done that to you.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
So I want to say that, there's a lot of different things we could talk about this film, like its production history, because there's a lot of just interesting stuff there about how this became a Disney film. The fact that it is a film that uses computer graphics, at a time when there weren't a lot of computer graphics. There were certainly special effects, but not actual CG renderings. As a very common feature in film in 1986 when this film drops. But I do want to talk a little bit about this theme that you brought up, because when we talked about E.T., it was interesting that as adults, we reacted very differently to the narrative about the adults in that movie. And I got the impression from your general reactions that you had a different reaction as an adult to this as well. And I think that it would be fair to say that this film is not like E.T. in that it doesn't spend that much time with the parents to really give a lot of material. It's a shorter film, and it's much more focused on David and his relationship with Max the ship than it is really the adults. Which is unlike E.T., which spends a lot of time with the relationship between the kids and specifically the mother.
Well, and that's just E.T. is just it's a much more nuanced film.
It is.
Which is part of it. So, we talked very much about that, how it sets the entire scene for the movie and who the mother is just in the first, 5 minutes of E.T., right?
Yeah.
We get so much out of just looking at the scene of the props and everything else that are there. Whereas in this one, it's mostly empty of those things, except for as, there's some sight gags and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's not really, it doesn't have the nuance of a film like E.T., which is fine, because this is a kid's film targeted at kids. But the difference is, whereas E.T. was a much more, I think, a broader level film.
It's a Spielberg film. So,
right,
yeah.
Exactly. So Spielberg was doing a lot with E.T. So yes, kids could also enjoy it, but really there's much more going on. Whereas this one is there's not actually a lot going on. It's mostly just a fun kids romp. But to tell that story, you also have to put in some very interesting aspects. And I think it's very true to the reactions that a 12-year-old would have, given the scenario that he's put in. And therefore, I think what the parents are going through is equally authentic.
Yeah, I would say part of what you're talking about is the difference in tone for the type of film.
Yes.
E.T. is a much more, I would say, a more serious film. It's really trying to be a meaty, serious film that also is, approachable by kids. So there are moments of whimsy, like when they're flying on the bikes and stuff, and that's very cute and wonderful, and it's pretty exciting. But this film is, I would say, it's much more about fun. And so there's a lot more jokes here. There's a lot more play, and when Max is being silly, that's really played up here. And I want to say pretty impressively, given that if you turn off the sound and you just watch what's going on visually, like the little robot eyeball thing doesn't move a whole lot. It kind of moves around the thing, and it kind of has a little bit of sideways motion. It can close its iris, but it's pretty limited in the amount of actual motion. And yet, because of the voice acting done by Paul Rubens, there's just a lot of character that comes through what are very simple actions. They do, I think, a very good job. But it's partly because I think that they're not interested in, like, this needs to feel totally real. This needs to feel immersive, but not necessarily real. In the same way that E.T., where, like, E.T. literally, like, you have to believe that they're interacting with a real alien, like, because otherwise it doesn't work. It becomes Mac and Me, basically, which, don't get me wrong, I like Mac and Me, I care about it a great deal, but those aliens are creepy, and they also don't look real.
Right.
In Mac and Me, they wanted to still be serious like E.T., and it doesn't work. But in this, they want it to be playful and joyful. And so Max is at first very stiff and like, I'm an AI and I just affirmative and, all of those kinds of things that he says. But then when he becomes silly, it's sort of very playful and he kind of dances and all of these little tiny things that they do. I think that makes this very effective in what it's trying to do. I giggled and had a blast watching this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I watched most of it with my son, which was hilarious because he was super into the score.
It's so good.
Which is like full synth.
Yes.
Everybody, full synth. It is the most 1980s score that the 1980s produced. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. But I have to admit that when the first scene came up, I was like, wait, okay, now I know what I'm getting myself into. Okay, we're good. I agree. And it's an adventure film very specifically versus E.T., which is a drama. This is an adventure. I wouldn't even say it's necessarily like just for the funsies. It is an adventure story. Very much in the grain of something like Goonies, right?
Yeah, it's a lot like Goonies.
It's a lot like Goonies in many, many ways, which I think came later, though, correct?
No, Goonies came out the year before, but, it's still tonally pretty similar. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think so. Clearly, this film probably was not influenced by Goonies. I don't know how long the production was or anything like that, though, so maybe. But it's definitely of an era. I mean, like, that era of children's films, they all kind of have the same tone in terms of the adventure. And when I was a kid, like, that was totally what I was into. Even Willow tends to feel kind of like that adventure story, except that it's a fantasy adventure. I will say this film is very aware of where it is in relation to E.T., though, which is why you get a couple of gags about it.
I love it.
Which are hilariously done. Like, this movie is honestly, it's a smart script. Like, for all that is very 1980s, it has a very pop culturally aware, so it's very, like, it is very rooted in 1986, let me tell you.
Yeah.
The Coke joke.
Yeah, which kind of Coke do you want?
Which kind of Coke?
New Coke, caffeine-free Coke? Yeah.
Vanilla Coke, Cherry Coke, Diet Coke, or I can't even remember all of them.
I don't think vanilla and cherry existed yet. I think it was...
she definitely mentioned Cherry Coke.
Okay, now we have to Google it. We have to know, because this was the Coke versus Pepsi Wars. And so this is a big deal. Yeah, so she says New Coke, Classic Coke, Cherry Coke, Diet Coke, or caffeine-free Coke.
Oh, right.
Yep.
Caffeine-free Coke. Ooh, forgot that one.
Yeah.
So, and there's quite a few things like that. But at the same time, there's some classics. So, See You Later, Alligator, right? Which is an older joke.
And then it becomes...
See You Later, Navigator.
I like that way better. I'm going to say that to you from now on. That's our new line.
It's good.
It's a good line.
It's a good line.
I love the bit, I cracked up so much when they go to Al's gator hut, and there's unfortunately a fat joke here, which I think it was unnecessary, because I think the funny part is just the fact that there is this a fairly tall, fairly large man just out in the middle of nowhere, just staring nonstop at this alien craft. And then literally when David gets off, he goes into it's a phone call, he asks for change, gets a phone call, and then he gets back on while all these onlookers are watching, gets in the ship, poof, goes off. And everyone's like, whoa, wow. And he goes, he just wanted the phone home.
He just wanted to phone home. Yeah. It's an entire scene of just hilarity. And like I said, smart script. It is very smartly done on every level. Like, all of the set design is very rooted in the time. Like, obviously. There's nothing... For all that this is a science fiction movie, the only thing that is set apart from 1986 or even 1978 is the ship itself. And meanwhile, the ship is a combination of both practical effects and computer graphics, which is something that in, today, we're still... There was that shift to full CGI, and now we're applauding people for going back to a combination of those two things, right? So this was at a time when CGI could only do so much, so they relied on practical effects for everything else. And that's what we have here. And it's done incredibly well. Like, as you were saying, the arm that holds the eye that is the AI it's limited in movement, but it's also done fairly speedily, given robotics were actually pretty good in 1986. And they use them to very good effect in this film. And then obviously there's some parts that are not robotics, but are still really cool looking. The CGI, frankly, still holds up pretty well for the most part. It's not perfect, obviously, mostly because their attempt at live footage of the world that they're flying over is not the best, but whatever. Be that as it may, at one point they go under the ocean, and that was cool.
Remember, this is also 5 years before Terminator 2, which gives us some more advanced versions of that kind of fluid silver.
Fluid dynamics, that's true. And it's beautifully done. And what I'm saying is that the world that's created in this movie is very seamless. It is very rooted in real life. Like, there's not a lot of things that you're like, oh, that seems totally outside the bounds of reason, except maybe Ralph. Ralph's a little strange, in terms of its design. I'm pretty sure people at NASA were a little bit smarter than that, but maybe not.
I mean, also very hopeful that you'd have a very functioning robotic AI thing that delivers food and is effective. Very, very hopeful.
Very, very hopeful, but at the same time, I think it's showing sort of a progression that, the AI that is Max is the thing that, that's the advanced thing. But look, this is the thing that we're trying to do, and his name is Ralph.
Yeah.
Which also is a thing that literally is trying to replace people. Ooh, that's disturbing.
Yeah. Also notice that it says Ralph. It's a food delivery system named Ralph.
Yeah, really, really smart. But what is it? The remote automatic labor facilitator, I think is what it's called. And you're like, labor facilitator? I think you mean labor thief. I'm just saying,
well, that would be a good point because this is the 1980s. And so there's a lot of concern about the use of robotics to replace, humans, because this is the era when we start to include that in car manufacturing. And
Yep. I mean, I'm 99% certain that the arm that is Max is literally one of those arms that was used in car manufacturing.
Very possible.
It's the same, it looks like the same base structure.
The interior, by the way, of the spaceship is aluminum.
It is aluminum. God, My son said, he was like, it's super cool, super sparkly and shiny. I would not want to clean that. And I have to agree.
I feel like it cleans itself.
I would hope so.
Max cleans itself. Well, I mean, he has that one alien in there that, it's just like an awful-looking slug monster. And when David asks him what's wrong with it, because he says, oh, that's just a very, don't mess with him. He's like, what's wrong with it? And his response is, oh, he just has a cold. And, you get a whole picture of this slug lifting up, and it's just
literally a snot monster.
It's a snot monster. So, like, definitely Max has to have an auto-cleaning system because otherwise all the little aliens he picks up are just getting poop and other kinds of gross things around. Yeah, so, like, a lot of what you're saying is, from a visual perspective, yeah, in some areas, like, it's a little weak just because of the time. It's doing the kind of thing that they do in Neverending Story when they're trying to do flight scenes, which is like, okay, like, I get that you didn't have, Thanos' cute purple butt or anything for these, but, you had to do what you had to do with what you got. But it does super effective for what it's doing, and I think they're very clever about trying to be minimal, that they use practical sets. They're not over-relying on the CG. They're using the CG almost entirely for the ship itself flying.
Right, and
yeah.
I think that's a really good point that you made, that they're trying to be minimal with what they're doing, right? And that's the case throughout this. There are not a lot of sets, and each set is used very effectively. It's not a big production piece, like, to be perfectly honest. Like, it could have been, but for the most part, what you're seeing is David in a very limited number of spaces. And even when on the ship itself is a limited space, even though he's flying around the world. So you get a lot of, like, flight footage, but otherwise, he's in the ship and it's limited to the ship. Or he's in his little room at NASA, or he's at home, and so on and so forth. But, like, I think there's maybe 5 sets in this entire movie.
Yeah, it's a pretty small number, and mostly everything else is outside.
Yes, but most of all those sets are like internal sets. They're not big outside set pieces,
right?
Except maybe with the cows and the helicopters. I think that's the biggest scene, and then the final scene in front of his house is maybe the biggest part.
Interesting. They did have to move some of the production to actual Florida, which is where this is set.
Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, to Fort Lauderdale, which is, again, where it's set. It's near Cape Canaveral and all of that good stuff. So, and what's interesting about that is, so I've lived in Florida. Some of you may know. And it made me think a lot about, like, normally when they want to do Florida, they don't go to Florida. They just do, like, some part of California that, like, looks vaguely like it's kind of jungly.
Vaguely Florida-ish. Yeah.
But it's never right. If you've been to Florida, you know. But there are moments in this when I was like, Is that Florida?
So my son, when they're flying over Florida, he was like, "Is that Florida?" And I'm like, "It used to be before Sprawl took over Florida. I'm pretty sure there was quite a bit of land like that in 1986.
There still is.
There still is sections like that, but I guarantee half of it's missing and it's now full of a land development, a real estate development that failed in 2000 or 2008. But be that as it may, that was kind of funny. Like, that, just seeing it and being like, whoa, there is not, where are all the houses that exist in these places? Like, why is the country so empty? It's so strange.
Well, I will just note, having lived in Florida, there's still a lot of places where you're like, gosh, they really haven't developed this part of Florida, have they? There are a lot of towns in Florida which is literally like you blink and you missed it. Like, you literally, if you blink, you'll miss the sign on the corner that tells you, like, you're in, like, Bumbodula or someplace.
I'm pretty sure getting out of Fort Lauderdale, though, was not that fast.
No, Fort Lauderdale's pretty well developed. Even in the 80s, it should have been. But what's fun is just, like, it is Florida. And, that it's very clear that they thought about the culture of Florida. So, because they're on the coastline of Florida, the parents own a boat literally across the street from them, right? They own a boat.
They own some pretty fancy property for Miami.
They own some good property, I would say.
Or Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, it probably wasn't worth very much back then, but nowadays that's like $12 million.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm going to laugh until I cry about where they live. That's a gorgeous home in a gorgeous location.
I just want to warn you, there's a good statistical chance that house doesn't exist anymore, given the number of hurricanes that have hit Miami since. But, there's a lot of interesting elements about the parents and the family in general. Clearly they are well-to-do. they're not presented as filthy rich.
No.
But they're, like middle class, upper middle class. I mean, it's the 1980s, so like middle class by comparison now, like that would be upper middle class today because you could make a decent living back in 1986, or technically 1978.
Yeah, 78 is when they were better off, and it is interesting to see that they seemingly have gone downhill a little bit since their son went missing, and that's kind of what I'd like to tackle next, because,
Sure.
like I said, to an extent, this is a story about 1980s. There was like a massive fear of kidnappings, and that's essentially what they believe has happened to their son David. So 8 years later, he's actually been declared dead, and you do get the sense that the family was in enough grief that their standing in the world is reduced. Like, they're living right underneath a highway, for instance, in the 1986 version of themselves. Whereas in the 1978 version, like, they have this, like, truly primo canal side house with boat accessed right in front of them. It's pretty spectacular, and I'm very jealous of that location, except that it's in Florida. But by the time you meet them again in 1986, they've definitely aged, and, David is freaked out by that at first. Well, I mean, he stays kind of freaked out by the fact that his parents have aged. And his brother, who was 8 years old, is now 16 years old, and things like that. But you can definitely see that this is a family that thought they'd lost something precious and suddenly got it back.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to do their best by him, which unfortunately leads to him getting, essentially locked up by NASA.
Yeah,
by the way, I didn't know NASA had that kind of...
Well, that's like an 80s
right,
thing where, like, apparently
thing.
NASA was some sort of big, giant organization with alien police.
Alien police, right.
Yeah.
And in general, I think there was this sort of idea, right? NASA always seems to have alien police in all the movies.
They always do. Why NASA?
All they did was send up some rockets, people. Like,
it's very strange because you'd think the organization that would have alien police would be like the Pentagon or the CIA.
But it's
right?
never the Pentagon or the CIA. It's always NASA.
It's NASA.
And I'm like, NASA, did you help out in these movies? Because I feel like you gave them... Right, they provided hats. That hat was pretty spectacular. But it's like, are you sure you want to use this as your propaganda machine? Because they are not painting you in a good light.
No.
I mean, I'm sorry.
I would do note that here, because what you're talking about is when David eventually goes with the NASA people, that we'll call them the alien police. Because what's going on here is that David, when he disappears and reappears again, he has these, he hears voices, and he's also... his brain is basically like sending out like alpha waves and speaking in binary code with computers, which nobody seems to understand. More importantly, he's sending like unusual messages and schematics of the ship and alien language and all of this kind of stuff. And so the NASA people get on it because they have the ship. And they realize when they get this thing, they realize this 12-year-old boy sent from his brain into a computer this picture. This boy and this ship have to have a connection. And the beginning of his return is all him in the hospital, like being poked and prodded. And there's nothing wrong with him because there isn't anything wrong with him. And then when the NASA people show up, he's like, I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore. And what's interesting to me is that the father, and technically the mother, but it's sort of patriarchal. The father is like, my son's decision matters here. And so it's his son changing his mind.
I was shocked by that, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. He gives him autonomy.
Right. I can't really recall a lot of other movies in the 1980s that a 12-year-old boy was given that kind of autonomy in this kind of a situation.
This serious of a situation.
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal, but they clearly have, like, they've just gotten their son back after 8 years, and they're terrified for him, but at the same time, they're letting him make the decision, and not because... they're like trying to spoil him because he's been gone for 8 years, but they genuinely seem to respect him and his decision.
Yeah.
Which was really interesting. Like, good parenting, guys. Like, honestly, genuinely good parenting.
Well, this is supported, in the very beginning of the film, because he has a dog, which is referred explicitly as his dog.
Yeah.
It's his dog. He takes care of this dog. He trains it. And the very opening scene is literally them at like a dog agility frisbee thing.
We have to talk about the opening scene, by
We'll
the
have
way.
to talk about it. But what I thought was really interesting is at the end of this movie, my brother and I watched this together, and we both were like, for a brief moment, we're like, oh, well, he gets to keep this little cute alien creature. Like, that's odd. You would leave it with a 12-year-old Earthling. And I was like, no, because I realized when they set up the very beginning of the movie, he actually is incredibly responsible for a kid. Because he takes care of his dog, he takes it for walks, he feeds his dog, he like dotes on this dog like it's his kid, like he loves this dog. He wants to do these agility training with his dog because he really wants to like be connected to his dog. And so when he keeps this alien at the end, it actually makes sense because the AI is not really fully human. It's going back to its makers, as it were, and is probably going to go back to doing its business. It makes sense to leave it with somebody who's actually going to care for him. I mean, we could obviously leave the question open here of like whether or not maybe we leave the last remaining specimen of an entire species of sentient creatures with an Earther who lives on a world where they have alien police. But still, it's really nice that there's that parallel that's being drawn between the beginning and the end.
That's true. And I do think that that's one of the things that this film does do, is it's very much one of those, like, moral of the story things, to the extent that this is a teaching story, much in the way that Grimm's fairy tales are, less as the warning portion of Grimm's fairy tales, but more as and I can't even remember the word of it, but it is a teaching story. Be responsible, listen to your parents, be respectful, listen to your kids, be nice to your little brother.
Yeah, that's a big one, because they're mean to each other.
They are genuinely mean to each other. And I was like, wow, okay.
They're, like, actually cruel. Compared to the Goonies, they are absolutely monsters to each other.
Yeah, you definitely get the idea that there is no love lost between those two brothers. So it's hilarious when he comes back at the end and he's finally been returned to 1978. By the way, if you haven't seen the movie, there is kind of a problem with him initially being returned in 1978 in that it might be dangerous, but he is. And he tells his little brother that he loves him, and his parents just look shocked.
Yeah.
Shocked.
Utterly shocked.
What happened to our child in the last 20 minutes?
Right, because to them, he's just being gone a little bit longer. And again, this is the 1980s, and even in the 90s, growing up as a kid, like kids, we would just leave and go places.
Oh, yeah.
This is not a thing that we do as much today in a lot of communities, but like, they just disappear. They just futz about for 2-3 hours just off in the woods someplace, which, okay, maybe not in Florida, but,
So that was my one thing. What are you doing tromping through the woods in Florida? There are gators there!
There are gators, venomous snakes, there's things that could ruin your day. Although, to be fair, I've not grown up in Florida, so I'm sure everybody just does that there, too. Exactly. It's probably normal. You probably just come home and your kid's like, I got bit by a rattlesnake. They're like, oh, you just got a little bit of bite there, sweetheart.
Here's some anti-venom. You're gonna be fine.
You'll be fine, cutie. It'll be all good. Would you like some sweet potato pie? That's not how they talk there, but...
I know. I think that's a really valid point, though, that this is an era where kids were allowed to go off on their own. But as I said, it was also an era that people were concerned about kidnappings. So at the beginning of the film, the mom sends David to meet his little brother Jeff, in the woods because he's walking home. And he's like, nothing's going to happen in a half-mile, Mom. And then something does happen, of course.
Not to his brother, to him.
To him, that he falls into a ravine. And I'm like, what are you doing walking around in the woods when there's a full-ass ravine in there? But what do I know?
Also, you notice his dog just abandons him?
Just abandons him. He's not a very well-trained dog in the beginning. You get the impression that they've just gotten him recently. And you do notice that later on, his now older little brother, is playing with the dog with a frisbee. And the dog can catch the frisbee and return it. So he has become much better trained in the 8 years that he has been missing. So that's a nice little oh, good, you were able to train the dog. Even though the little brother at the beginning says something like, you'll never be able to train that dog to catch a frisbee. because he's a little punk.
His brother is such a punk.
So the fact that their fears become a reality to an extent, that the kidnapping in their minds, or would have been in their mind before he's returned, that was a serious fear. And I really have to say that was very palpable in the relief that the parents feel in the 1986 portion of the film. And I got it. I felt that. Like, I remember running around in the woods, like, totally unsupervised. Absolutely no cell phone. They didn't exist. When I was 8 years old, and literally wandering around my neighborhood and beyond, very far beyond, into places that random people also went to, and that was allowed. That was the thing that you did. And somehow parents just did that without worrying, apparently. I don't know how, because by the time that I raised kids, the fear of death has definitely been imbued in parents, which is unfortunate. You know, it's when all the rates of, violent crime rates, all crime rates have gone down since 1986.
I mean, that's the thing, but there was this time when you didn't have that fear in the same way that I think parents coming into the game, like, after this era definitely did. So. Yeah.
It really was interesting to see, sort of, to have that reminder of, oh, that's what life was like back then.
Yeah. Like, the Goonies has this all over the place, right? The kids just literally are wandering around that, like, for miles, any direction, and nobody seems particularly perturbed by it. Whereas today, if, like, your kid, you found out they, like, putzed about on the other side of the island, like, you would be like, okay, like, you've got, like a 1 kilometer circle you're allowed to go through here.
You get 500 feet, child.
500 feet. You can't hear me when I yell, you're too far away.
And that was supposedly the rule when you were a kid, right? Like, if you can't hear me when I call you for dinner, you've gone too far. However, children always knew that dinner wasn't until approximately 6 p.m., so you could putz around for the intervening, like, 3 hours as far as you wanted to go, as long as by approximately 6 p.m., you were close enough to home to get called. That's definitely very much less of a thing now, unfortunately. But my point being that the fact that even the idea was in here was very much a sort of product of its time, right? Like, the idea of abduction was very much a product of the 1980s. You see it a lot in other films. Not alien abduction, by the way. Like, alien abduction was kind of more of a later thing, if I recall, where we started talking about, butt exploration.
I mean, they existed. They're all over film. I don't know if they're in as much children's film.
Yeah, I don't. But that was just very much a product of the 1980s.
Sure.
And I think it's one of those things that, I mean, we usually get to this a little bit later. It is one of those things that, as a cultural fear, to an extent, does not exist at the same level. Like, even though there's, like, subconsciously parents are like, oh no, that's a thing that we have to worry about because we are all paranoid. On the other hand, it's not something that we see in media nearly to the extent that we used to. Even though we've had some very, very high profile cases, in the last decade of kids that have went missing long ago getting rescued. And yet here we are with, it was totally a thing in the 1980s. Yeah. Definitely not a thing now. So definitely not in kids' movies.
Not that I don't watch as many as I used to because I'm not a kid anymore and I don't have kids yet.
I just like kids' movies because they're cool.
Yeah, but so you've probably seen more than I have. Yeah, but I can't think of any examples. I mean, there are, like, abductions, but it's always, like, superhero films where, like, someone gets kidnapped by the villain, which is not the same kind of abduction that is the worry here.
No, definitely not.
So, in the same way of, like, being abducted by aliens isn't really a real worry that parents generally have.
Yeah, that definitely wasn't a worry back then. And then, obviously, over all of this, we have the idea of government overreach.
Yeah, because this is a massive, again, the alien police of NASA, this secretive organization that none of us knew existed, but apparently Flight of the Navigator has confirmed the existence not of the men in black, but the men with pen protectors or whatever you call those things in their pockets. pocket protectors.
And I have to say, Howard Hessman, literally always a delight. He's one of my favorite character actors of all time. I will always remember him for WKRP in Cincinnati. He's just kind of amazing. But he's good in this. Like, he's genuinely still good in this. He's not, like, his characteristic. What's funny is Howard Hessman is kind of known for being very counterculture, and here he is in a suit. Which
very suity.
Which is kind of funny.
Yeah, well, one of the things that interested me was that, a lot of the concern and worry that the kid feels, where he's feeling like he's trapped, etc., could be resolved by them just explaining what's going on.
Right.
Because they have an idea, and they promise him answers, which is why he goes in the first place. He's like, fine, I want my answers, and I want to go back to being normal. And if they just said to him, hey, okay, so here's what we think's going on. We think that you've had communication with an alien spacecraft and it has put messages in your brain, and we're going to plug you to these machines, and that's not going to hurt or anything. It's not doing any harm. It's just reading your subconscious brainwaves, and we're going to see what the answers are. It's going to seem a little scary, because you're not saying these things, but your brain is giving us the answers. But, this is helping us. If they just done that, this movie actually loses its plot. Because then he becomes
completely.
Also, for
cool.
the love of God, he asked for McDonald's in this movie. The second you hear that, they should be showering this kid with Happy Meals.
Happy Meals, left and right. Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, because of the fact that, we see that a lot of films about kids during this era, right? And it's interesting that on one hand, you have parents who are respectful of their child and his decisions. But on the other hand, you have the scientists who are like, no, kids don't matter. We don't care about them.
Right.
Or police or whoever it is. The authority figures never listen to the kids.
That's precisely it, yeah.
Hence why we have our plots, granted. But, it is really interesting that one of the things that we're seeing here is sort of that push and pull between children and authority.
Yeah, and it's there's a very clear message here of if you just talk to kids like they're not, I don't know, whatever the word would be, dumb,
they're not 12-year-olds.
Yeah, if you just don't talk down to them,
yeah.
And you're just honest with kids, they'll understand a lot.
Yeah.
And you'll mitigate a lot of the difficulties when you're trying to do, I don't think the scientists in this are evil.
No.
Despite being the alien police.
Right. But you'll note that one of the things that is happening throughout this film, when between the encounter with the alien police and the ship, there's no violence.
None.
They actually are carrying guns at one point. I think they pull them out.
Yeah.
No shots are ever fired.
Right. But the threat is there.
The threat is there, granted. But meanwhile, this NASA is actually communicating with people around the globe. Very specifically, it's Japan. They're communicating with people around the globe. No one's shooting at this thing.
Yeah, which is interesting. There's very little violence anywhere in this film. Or none. There's really none. No violence. Other than the brothers. Who are kind of loosely violent. He gives them a noogie, basically.
And everybody does that. They don't even call it a noogie, which was weird.
Yeah, I don't know what he called it, but we called it noogies when I was a kid, so whatever.
Yeah, now I'm worried about that
Sorry,
word.
for those that don't know what a noogie is, in case you might come from a culture other than ours, it's when you grab someone's head and you rub your knuckles into the top of their head. Yeah, that's what a noogie is. So I don't know what the other terms would be, but yeah, there you go. Yeah, so there's no violence in this film, which I think is, fitting that this film eventually gets picked up by Disney. Disney buys all the rights to these and then distributes it through Buena Vista, which is I think their international division for distribution. I can't remember. But, this is originally produced by a different company with Omnibus Computer Graphics providing the CG done here. This company is a Canadian company. A number of the actors are Canadian actors, so it's essentially a Canadian/Norwegian production, because it's also briefly filmed in Norway. And Viking, I think Viking Films or Viking Pictures or something is one of the production companies. Yeah.
It's Canadian, American, Norwegian. It's a global production, but still the idea that there is actual global coordination essentially in terms of tracking the ship is still very surprising. And they specifically picked Japan, which I was like, okay, Japan.
Well, I mean, maybe it's something to do with the cultural context. 1980s, increased trade with Japan.
Right,
The
exactly.
arrival, especially, we see the increased arrival of Japanese cars and other technologies.
When was the Toyota facility built in Fremont? Is it Fremont? There was a lot, obviously. And
Yeah, I was going to Google it, but yeah,
yeah, there is a lot going on between Japan and the United States at this point.
tons. Yeah.
But thankfully, this was not a film that went with the 1980s version of the Yellow Panic, quote unquote.
No, they're just like people, and like the
They're
ship
just
shows up
people.
in Tokyo,
Well,
and they're like, oh.
Well, interestingly, it's just like Japanese tourists, and they're all flashing pictures, which
Right.
is like a very stereotypical portrayal of Japanese people in 1980s cinema. But at least it's not the bad
It's not a bad portrayal.
stereotyping.
Yeah.
It's just the kind of like stereotyping, which I guess is not the worst. Like
I mean, at least they're not yellow perils or presented as bad guys. Like,
exactly.
we didn't fire them, but the Japanese did. Like, at least they're not doing that.
Right. And there's no like commercial fears here. There's none of that that's going on. So that's nice. But it was interesting that they picked Japan as the location that they were going to. And I think it was just for the comedic effect of people just taking pictures.
Yeah.
And they honestly could have done that anywhere. If it had stopped in Hollywood, you would have gotten exactly the same thing. Because what was kind of funny about this is that the ship essentially becomes a novelty. Nobody's afraid of it. It's just
That's
like
it's
just like oh, look at the spaceship. And there's a lot of pointing and like jaw dropping and then picture taking, but no real fear. The only fear that is in this film is fear for David and his safety. And honestly, the NASA scientists seem more afraid about his safety in terms of his nearness to the ship because, like, for whatever reason, they're all still afraid of radiation. Like, this ship could end up killing him at any point in time.
I think part of this is, yeah, they're obviously concerned for David. I do think they're afraid of the ship, but they're not afraid of it in the same way as like we might see in like Independence Day, where it's like, okay, like the ship's coming, we got to blow it up. They're afraid of like that they just don't know.
Yeah, that lack of understanding.
Yeah, because the first thing they get is like the only information they've had from this ship is it communicates with the boy, and it has flown 560 light years away to this other world, right? By near light or possibly faster than light travel. And then they have a whole bunch of alien text, right? Which they can't translate. It's going to take them forever to translate. So this is all about the unknown for them. So when they pull guns out, it's not because they necessarily know the ship is dangerous. They're pulling it out because like they honestly just don't know. Like, is it going to kill David? Is it going to kill them? Who's it going to kill? Technically, everybody this ship flies over at Mach 10 should be dead. I just want to be clear.
Yeah, but that's kind of a thing. Like when it plummets back down from space, I'm like, oh, you're all dead.
Yeah. Just the speed with which it moves and accelerates. There's a lot of dead people.
But they hand wavy that bit out because that's just not as fun,
I mean, it's also an alien spaceship that can go at or past the speed of light, like, and time travels, and is voiced by Paul Rubens. So at this point, like, who cares? It doesn't need to be realistic.
No, it doesn't. So why don't we wrap this up and give what we think modern audiences would think of this film and your final thoughts.
Well, look, I don't have children, so I have no idea how kids are going to react to this. This film was just a lot of fun. I had as an adult, I probably had more fun because I get all the 80s references and the jokes about E.T. and things like that. It's an enormous amount of fun. And that's part of why I'm really concerned because there is technically a reboot that is in the works right now, and I don't know what that really means. Neil Blomkamp was at one point attached to this, but I don't think he is anymore. We don't know if they're doing they're going to do just a different story but with similar themes. I don't know. I get real concerned.
If they do a gritty reboot,
I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's Disney, so it can't be. It's going to be something still kind of kiddie. But I think part of what makes this film just still work is it's just a lot of fun. It's very pleasurable to watch. You know, the 80s music is at times hilarious, but also like you could dance to it. You could really boogie. You know, you could get down, you know, as they say on the dance floor. You know what I'm talking about. You remember.
To the Beach Boys.
Yeah, you could also do. Oh man, I danced to that too.
I did.
So,
oh, absolutely.
yeah. So overall, I just think that this is just very well done for what it is, you know, and it works really effectively. The performances are great. You know, Joey Kramer's exceptional here, and honestly, it's just not fair that someone can give such a good performance and yet almost nobody knows who Joey Kramer is. So, but there it is. What about you?
So it's too bad Joey Kramer was not able to have much of a career after this film, because he really was a spectacular young performer.
He was.
And unfortunately, it just didn't work out for him once he got older, as is tragically the case for a lot of child actors, as I mentioned before. But aside from that, I really enjoyed watching this film. I will fully admit it was a joy to watch. And despite the fact that obviously Paul Rubens / Pee Wee Herman, became sort of anathema, whatever way you pronounce that word, to the world because of, sitting in the back of a dark theater and playing with himself. Why, Paul? Why?
I mean, he's made a comeback.
He has. Oh, for sure. And this is, much older, but I'm also 43 years old. So I remember the entire cycle of Paul Rubens' career. Keep in mind. I loved Pee-wee's Playhouse. A year after this film was made, he worked with the director a second time on Pee-wee's Big Top Adventure.
I think so, yeah.
Which I loved when I was a kid. It was a really fun film. Like, Pee-wee Herman did great work. And it's hilarious that he tried to, like, supposedly, quote unquote, disguise himself for this movie, because he makes that ship.
He really does.
He is a delight at the ship. And as you said, his vocal performance really gives the ship life once it's, taken on sort of some of the human characteristics of David by downloading his brain. Because otherwise, it could have been a very stiff performance, because it's just it's a robotic arm. Like, what do you do with that? Especially back then. They did not have, like, exceptionally good technology. Granted, still, they've been releasing the General Dynamics, like the dog, still looks like about as, fluid as the arm in Flight of the Navigator.
Yes, but controls itself.
But it controls itself. Yeah, granted. True. But in terms of, like, the actual motion, yeah, it's very stiff. I mean, look, it's not a particularly fluid thing, right? It could have been a very stiff performance for all that. It's made out of aluminum, so it's very shiny, but even, like, being a sparkly, still could have just been a very kind of dead performance if they had chosen basically anybody else to imbue the character that is Max, the human-ish AI. He was brilliant. And it was so much fun to kind of, like, go back into my history with Paul Rubens and be like, oh, it's Pee Herman, he's so much fun! Let's just forget everything else! And it was really nice for me as a parent to kind of feel those extra level of emotions that the parents would have felt. And also just see the emotional vulnerability of the child. All that said, it is very rooted in 1986. And that is going to be your problem with contemporary audiences, is that a lot of it's going to pass over people's heads. Like, to be perfectly honest, there are quite a few jokes in there. The Coke joke? Who's going to get the Coke joke except people our age, right?
I feel like it doesn't hit the same way.
It does not.
The Coke joke is funny because we have lots of different types of Coke today, but it has a different meaning for people who remember the 80s.
Right. And, it's like, okay, so yeah, there's different flavors of Coke. Cool. Why is that a thing that they're joking about? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that joke probably falls a little because you don't realize that in 1978, like, they basically had one Coke. I know, we live in a glory age. She makes, like, a
quip, like, I'll see if that exists. And you're like... I think she's actually at that point referring to McDonald's in general because he doesn't know. Like, his McDonald's still a thing, right?
Right, because before that, he's like, is Starsky and Hutch still on? And she's like, no.
Speaking of which, by the way, the director or the writer also wrote for Starsky and Hutch. So
Did like 3 episodes or something.
Yeah, that explains that Starsky and Hutch reference.
Yeah, but you're right. Like, there's jokes that don't land.
I barely even remember what Starsky and Hutch is, so I'm pretty sure. I mean, granted, you still, as a modern viewer, would kind of get that, like, out of time thing for him. Like, what the hell is Starsky and Hutch? You know, like, oh, that's why, because it was canceled. Oh, yeah, like, of course it was. That sounds really old.
Yeah. I think, like, there's 2 things about this that are, like, the 80s-ness of it. One is, like, there are just references that are very much of, like, the late 70s and early to mid-80s things, which are things that probably a lot of kids aren't going to really get, and it's probably fine, most of them. And then there's the stuff which is just the things that we don't do anymore, or at least not as much. Like, there are some fat jokes here that are really overboard. And this is also the second film in Disney's history to have curse words in it. Although I think their version of curse word is like butt breath. So I don't know if that counts.
Scuzzbucket? By the way, I'm totally bringing Scuzzbucket back. Yeah. That is amazing.
But yeah, so like those are the kind of the 2 ways that this probably doesn't land as well with audiences. Yeah. I think if you can get past those, it's just, honestly, it's just fun.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. It is a fun film. I just quickly, before we end, want to touch on the fact that the opening sequence of this movie is brilliant. The opening, 5 minutes.
With the dog training and him trying to get his dog to catch the Frisbee?
No. The fact that the very first thing that you see looks like a flying saucer.
Oh, yeah, that's very clever. Yeah.
It's very clever. So you think you're seeing a flying saucer from, the very stereotypical, UFO, really bad footage type of scenarios, like found footage UFO, and it's this shiny silver object that's just kind of floating in the sky over a city, and you're like, oh, is that the flight of is that the ship in this movie? Oh no, that's a Frisbee. Oh, okay, that's clever, you got me there. They do it again, right after, when the family's about to get in the car, everybody's leaving this Frisbee competition, and suddenly this shadow dominates the scene, and everybody looks up, and you're like, oh, is it the alien spaceship now?
Nope.
No, it's just a blimp.
Goodwill. Goodyear. Goodyear blimp.
You got me there.
Yeah,
it was clever, and I really appreciated those clever moments that were throughout this movie, because it's not just that beginning. It really is. It is a very tight script. It's a very clever script. It's a funny script. It's a fun movie. I think there's some moments that maybe it lingers a little bit too long on things, but beyond that, it's fun. You're right. It's just a fun movie. So
it's a fun movie.
Yeah.
Well, okay, we gotta stop.
Yep, we do.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for Into the Wardrobe. Join us next time whenever we do that for the next classic film from our childhood that we'll cover.
Yeah, and otherwise, that's it for today. If you would like to let us know what you thought about this episode, head on over to skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions, as we said earlier. Also, you can go ahead and follow us at Skiffy and Fanty on both Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to subscribe to our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter, I'm sure Stephen Geigenmiller would appreciate it, and so would we. Finally, if you like what we do, and obviously you do like what we do, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty, and give us some love by leaving a 5-star review, not a 4-star, a 5-star review on iTunes, even if all you say is pants, just like Duke does in half of our awkward endings, right?
Not this time.
Ooh! You can find me at LoopDeLoo on Twitter and Patreon.
And you can find me at Sean Duke or on patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
Awesome sauce, and that's all we wrote. Now it's time to make it awkward, Sean.
So, there was an alligator in this film, but he was an invisible alligator that was in somebody's skirt. Aren't you glad I didn't say pants? Awkward ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.